Taavo, if you can give us a brief insight into you, please.
Yeah, no, happy to. I'll start with business school. I went to Babson. For those of you that know Babson, it's known for entrepreneurship. And I started there because I felt like I was the least likely entrepreneur in my class. And I ended up becoming a business owner with my colleague. And we ended up scaling the business and selling it to a public company. And from there, I transitioned into executive coaching and specializing in private equity. So the work that I do today, I either coach the heads of private equity firms or portfolio company CEOs.
Sam, same question for you, please.
So I am a Jack Welch poster child for all things General Electric. So I started my career there, spent about 17 years in a number of different roles, running a couple of different businesses, predominantly healthcare, but also GE Capital on the financial services sector. But after moving 10 times in 14 years, I decided that was enough. And I started consulting. And that's how I got into the private equity arena, spent a lot of time supporting private equity-backed portfolio company leadership as they think about growth strategy and execution against the value creation plan.
Excellent. Lots to cover here. Jack Welch, love him or hate him, a hella successful individual. No questions on that. So what's one mistake that you guys see private equity-backed chief executives making, and what would you suggest to correct them?
I'll start, and then if Taavo wants to chime in as well. I think one of the common things that we see, and we do chat about this in the book, is strategy. And so a lot of CEOs struggle to take the strategy and keep it, pushing it down. Sorry, can we start over? I'm already needing to re-edit.
All right,
So,
just go for it.
Okay. So a lot of CEOs we work with can struggle to actually penetrate the organization with their strategy. So they develop that clarity of where the business is going, what the vision looks like, but it often gets trapped at the top. And so the best CEOs do a great job of making sure that not just their leadership team understand the strategy, but that it really permeates the organization and every employee can understand what their role is in bringing that strategy to fruition and how it needs to be executed. Taavo, you want to add?
Yeah, and Alex, I'm going to cheat here. It's from my perspective, it's really two things. I think one is around focus. I think every CEO and leadership team that I've worked with, that Sam and I have worked with, they try to do too much all at once. And there isn't enough organizational capacity to actually execute effectively on the core things that really matter most to the investment. And I think on the second part of it is really around talent, right? So you need a great leadership team to be able to execute on the value creation plan. And what we find is too many CEOs hold on to critical talent that is either average or below average. And sometimes it's out of this thinking that they're good enough and it'll be too disruptive to make a change, or they're overly loyal. Maybe that person helped them get to the place where they are today, so they feel a lot of guilt. And so being able to be disciplined and courageous about making critical talent moves in the spirit of accelerating value creation is really part of where I think a lot of CEOs struggle.
And we had a CEO in our research shared a great story about that, where she said one of her mentors, the best advice that she ever got was, the first time you think about firing someone, do it, because you just aren't going to come back from that. And too many CEOs hesitate for the reasons Taavo cited. And you really have to be thoughtful about making those moves as quickly as possible once you realize that's what needs to happen. But also being thoughtful about the pacing of the changes. And as you think about those transitions that happen in the organization, so that you're phasing them in appropriately at the right time.
So we'll I would add, oh, sorry, I just would add one more thing, because I think it's really important around from the private equity side, around kind of being a great partner for the CEO, especially around talent. And so one thing that we always recommend is having quarterly talent reviews with your board, so you can align them as partners in kind of where talent is inside the organization and the status of that talent. And then also, when you think about, many of these CEOs who are coming into these investments, one of the critical jobs to be done is often upgrading the senior leadership team. And so one act that the managing director or member of the deal team can provide to the CEO is around, look, we understand that maybe one of these folks will not work out. So giving them kind of the psychological safety, if you will, to be able to make a move sooner rather than later is an important conversation to have with the CEO. As you know, more than 50% of CEOs don't make it through the investment period. And so the CEO could interpret it as that it's a failure on my part versus, look, it's normal that one of these may not work out of the 3 or 4 new execs you're bringing on board.
Makes sense. So a few questions on the back of that. So you mentioned about the key mistake, or one of the mistakes that from your research, that how good how the average CEOs hold on to people for too long. What have you seen from good CEOs that transition from holding average to raising the bar? You already mentioned once, which is kind of mindset of, if you're already thinking about firing that person, let's get to work, let's get that done. What else have you seen and you recommend other chief execs to adopt, and probably just anyone who's a manager, if I'm going to be honest?
I think there's a few pieces to consider. So first is, based on the strategy and the value creation plan for the business, identifying the top critical roles that are really responsible for driving either value creation or value enablement, and making sure that you have A players in those roles, right? Realistically, you can't have A players in every role. But so how do you look at what's most critical to moving the business forward and make sure that you have the right talent in those roles, that they're well compensated, that they're well motivated, they're not looking over their shoulder or thinking about going to a competitor, and they're really laser focused on what the business needs to be able to execute. That's a huge first step. It can take some time. And I think as CEOs consider who's in the business now and whether or not they are a player level talent and if they're capable, one question that they can ask themselves is, if knowing what I know now, as I look ahead at the business for the next 2 to 3 years, would I hire this person to take this role? Do they have the skills that I think are critical now? Because to Taavo's point earlier, they may feel this sense of loyalty for someone who helped them to get from, the start of the business to where they are today, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that person has the right skill set to move from where they are today to where they need to be in the future. Taavo, you want to add?
Yeah, and I would make sure too, what we often see is there can be a lack of clarity in terms of what the key outcomes are for a specific role. And so making sure that the CEO is aligned, especially with those critical roles around here. These are the 2 to 3 outcomes that are mission critical the next 6 to 12 months. Let's really align on that. And then number 2, which is, I think this is less talked about, but just from the CEO perspective, just make sure, again, especially your critical roles, that they're designed correctly. We've seen instances where some of the most important value creation roles are mission impossible from a design perspective for that person. And so sometimes this role should be 2 separate roles. And so really making sure that the role is designed the right way so that person can flourish in that role.
You guys referenced something interesting, which I haven't heard about. Well, I like the concept. No one's talked to me about that before, about the quarterly talent review. So I'm sure we can all sit down at a table and assess talent, but delving into that in detail, what does that look like from the best chief execs that you've worked with? How do they, if you can give us a bit of an insight as to maybe some of the questions they asked about that and how they begin to measure performance with their business, obviously recognizing that that is going to be different in every business, providing they have metrics and measure people properly.
I think there are a couple of approaches. Sam, I'll let you talk about the 9 box, but I'll just talk about something simple, in a simple mechanism, which is just create a grid and around, for the CEO to line up maybe their top 12 to 14 kind of critical roles. And along each name, you can evaluate and you can, color code this red, yellow, green, but around what's their current performance, what's their potential would be a second one. Also, is there a risk? What's the level of risk with that role in terms of them potentially departing? And then also is around succession would be a fourth one we would probably recommend, which is, if they left the organization today, is there someone that could ready to step into that role tomorrow? Sam, I'll let you probably talk about maybe the 9 box as well.
I just want to add to what Taavo was just talking about with succession planning. So, especially for critical roles, but ideally for all leadership roles, if you think about, if that person were to leave for whatever reason, who's your emergency backup? Who's ready now to take that role? Who could be ready in 1 year or 2 years? And literally putting names in those spots so that you understand, if something happens, this person is gone tomorrow, who steps in on an emergency basis or who's capable of taking that role really starts to highlight for the organization. If you've got a bunch of blank spots, what are you going to do to develop the successors in your business, or recognize that you're going to need to make some outside hires and be thoughtful about what that will look like. On the 9 box, so the 9 box is a basic grid. So the 3 columns across the top relate to performance. So it's either needs improvement, meets expectations, or exceeds expectations. And then 3 rows are around potential. So high, medium, or low. And you're literally placing everyone in the organization into one of those boxes. So, and you have to kind of think about them separately. So what is this person's current performance in their current role based on the expectations and the outcomes that you're looking for? And then what do you see as their potential in terms of their ability to take on more or ability to be promoted up into another larger role? You can have someone who exceeds expectations and is low potential. The example I would use is a salesperson, right? You might have a phenomenally talented salesperson who has absolutely no desire to move into management. And that's okay. That's great. So low potential isn't necessarily a bad thing, but understanding where your organization's resources plot across that grid. If you don't have anyone in the exceeds expectations from a performance perspective, why not? Or if everyone is low potential, that's a challenge, right? What are you going to do to bring in some talent from the outside to help freshen your bench and make sure that you're building skills and competencies that can scale with the business over time?
I like that. So a lot of that sits around where are you going to prioritize your time? And I think a lot of chief exec, whatever you want to job titles you want to put it, anybody in a leadership management role, really, prioritization becomes the problem. We end up fixing things that don't end up bringing the returns. I like the way that you talk about kind of critical roles and what's the absolute must have to take this business through to a liquidity event that's absolutely needed to have an athlete in, and then being able to measure them. I think that's really useful. So you referenced it earlier, but tell us about this kind of 2-year research study. I understand it's of kind of 50 or so P-back chief executives who averaged a 6.2 MOIC.
Taavo, would you like to talk about the why, and I can share kind of who we talked to?
Yeah, no, for sure. So we got inspired to do the research about 5 years ago now, where, again, I mentioned this statistic earlier, but more than 50% of CEOs don't make it through the investment cycle. And so that signaled a couple things to us. First, it's not just about making better hiring decisions. We thought of it more of as a kind of a systemic challenge within private equity itself, where one is there are 2 implications around that. First is just around the private equity sponsors themselves, right? Around how they support support the CEO and leadership team, or align with the CEO and leadership team. What we see is they can overstuff the value creation plan with way too many initiatives, and there's a huge burden on the team. They can create distractions in terms of data, reports that they need from the leadership team, taking away from reporting the news versus making the news. And on the flip side, it's really on the CEOs themselves around how they're evolving, developing, and adapting, right? So when you think about a CEO within a private equity investment, how are they moving along from version 1.2, 2.0, 3.0 of themselves to make sure that they're scaling and growing with the investment? And so that's why we wrote the book and did the research around how can we help provide a clear playbook for what really drives success, so more CEOs and investments are delivering and thriving.
And so in terms of who we spoke to, we sat back and said, all right, if we really want to understand not just what strong leaders are doing to be successful, but how they're doing it, let's seek out those CEOs who've been able to achieve 5 times MOIC or better, Or we also spoke to some CEOs who had, roughly 3x MOIC consistently on a repeatable basis. So we wanted a mix. We didn't want someone who sort of just got lucky. So we also screened out for that. We worked by referral through our network. And just we're screening not just for that financial performance, but also for leaders who demonstrated strong values and the ability to really build sustainable businesses for the long term. So not just slash and burn to drive EBITDA and then exit, and or not just somebody who got lucky with the market, growth, where that drove all of their success. So we spoke to more than 50 CEOs. On average, they had almost 12 years of CEO experience when we were interviewing them and participating in the research. We also spoke to about 25 private equity leaders, so either PE firm CEOs, partners, managing directors, operating partners, and they further validated what we were hearing from the CEOs in terms of what and how people were really driving those better than average returns. So altogether, we had about 900 years of private equity experience across the research. And so that's what we've then synthesized into the 5X model that we show in the book.
Perfect. So what do you, big question here, so I'm happy to hear 1, 2, 3, depending on you guys' perspectives, but what do you find that separated the average CEO from the high-performing ones?
Yeah, I think it's a number of actions, and it's kind of outlined in the book around kind of there were common approaches that we found to value creation, and I'll let Sam jump into kind of each one of those kind of 5 core elements in a moment. But I would think more stylistically, what you see with these CEOs is the level of urgency and speed that they operate inside the organization and the team. They create an incredible amount of clarity inside the organization on what winning looks like. And when you look at these CEOs, there's almost, you can see a level of impatience, and that's really driving the speed within the organization. But I'll let Sam talk about kind of the core elements of the model.
So the result of all of our research was the 5X model. And what we tried to do is break down what we've learned from these highly successful CEOs into 5 components. And we talk about them, but they're not mutually exclusive, right? The reality is there's overlap between all of these different areas. But these we view as the 5 essential responsibilities for the CEO and the leadership team, because it's not just the CEO that needs to drive this process through the business. The leadership team needs to also be executing against this and penetrating and cascading all of this down into the organization. So it starts with strategic clarity. So as Taavo was just getting at, is everyone aligned to the vision for where the business is going and the path to get there? So from the CEO to the leadership team to the board and all of the employees, does everybody understand what winning looks like and how the business is going to approach it? From there, it comes to scalable talent, which we've talked about already, but this is the notion of, do you have the right people in your most critical roles to drive the execution around that strategy, and push to get A-player talent in those critical roles to help the CEO and the leadership team be successful. The third is relentless focus. We touched on this again as well. This is the notion that you really understand what your 2 or 3, handful of value creation drivers are, and that's where the business focus goes. And so eliminating as many distractions as possible. And the reality is that just too many businesses are trying to do too much. And so making sure that everyone understands what those top priorities are and that's where the resources, time, and attention are placed. Fourth is disciplined execution. And so this is, do you have a management operating system that can monitor progress or lack thereof, right? That you've got key KPIs and dashboards, that you're tracking things, that you have early vision into when you're failing, and that you can adapt and adjust course as needed. And then last but not least is energized culture. So is your culture the key enabler of your strategy? Have you really engaged all of your employees? Again, do they all understand what's happening in terms of where the business is going? And how do you leverage your employee base as a value creator itself, and make sure that that's helping to differentiate you?
Perfect.
And I would just add one thing, sorry, which is when you look at these kind of these 5 core pillars of the model. Hopefully, none of those are surprising to the audience. But what's important to share is what we found is a couple of things. For CEOs, they may say, like, we're already doing those things, but there can be a huge gap between knowing and actually doing. And you can go inside their organization. They may think that, all employees understand, the vision and the strategy and the values of the firm, but you go talk to some of the middle managers and they're saying different things. And so that's one. And then 2 is part of what we did in the book and our research is to say, what does excellence look like? And so for each one of those, there's 10 to 12 critical actions. And so the issue may be for the CEO, they may be doing these things, but not doing them well. And that's part of the issue and the challenge.
You've just literally answered my my question. I was about to fire at you there, to be fair. So I want to dive into that a little bit more detail. So what I was going to say is I'm a pragmatist, so I love a model. Like everything, from a Patrick Lencioni model to a Maslow on management rather than hierarchy of needs. It's been overdone. But I love my models to be able to go, hey, let's drop this in, and it makes it scalable and repeatable as well. So the first point that you mentioned, which I want to dive into a little bit, strategic clarity aligned to the vision and the path to get there. Now, I know that if I speak to any private equity firm in the world, they're going to go, strategic vision, we want to take this business to X revenue, Y EBITDA, exit 5 years, we'll do it in 7, would love to do it in 3, probably end up in 8, etc. So if we just take that as a measure of our industry as what good looks like at the moment, and I'm hoping you're going to tell me that's not good enough. If not, that's ticks for everybody. What are these guys doing at the chief exec level that's just so much more than just, hey guys, we're going to exit this business in that time frame for that multiple for this amount of revenue?
Yeah, I actually love the example that you just gave because it's classic of what Taavo and I see when we're working in private equity, which is when you ask private equity folks, what's your vision for this business? It's a numerical answer, right? It's revenue or EBITDA, and that is not a business vision. That is the output metric of whatever you're going to do. So part of what we really work with CEOs on is how do you actually create a compelling vision for your business that resonates with your customers, with your employees, with your private equity sponsor and your board as well. But it has to be something that's a little more motivating, inspiring than we want to grow to X millions of dollars of EBITDA. So that's one of the places that we start is really understanding what is the vision for the business? What is the value proposition here? How do you differentiate yourself? What does that look like? And that's really important. And then connecting that back to the values and the cultural foundation for the business to make sure that that resonates with the employees as well. Taavo, do you want to add?
No, I think Sam's articulating well, which is it's taking a systemic view to getting a great outcome. And that's where the kind of the value of the model comes into play, which is look how well are we executing on these 5 kind of fundamentals, right? And I think the other part of it too is from a strategic clarity perspective, we're amazed at times around, we'll sit down with a leadership team and we'll just ask them a very simple question, like a Peter Drucker question around who's your customer? Right? Or what business are you in? And we'll actually have the leadership team write them down on a piece of paper and then show their piece of paper so they can't change their answer. And it's amazing where you see, different customers or different lines of businesses they think that they're really in. And so getting that clarity and that alignment is so important. And that's where a lot of them can kind of misstep. They make assumptions. And so, the CEO can't be making assumptions about where the organization is headed.
Okay, I like that. I like that a lot from there. So, okay, so that gives a lot more clarity around that. Nice, easy 5 model to follow as well. So, diving back into the research side and what came out of it. So, you came out with your 5-step model that you've got there. What else are the kind of critical takeaways for chief executives that everyone just, hey, if you're a chief exec, this is another thing that you just absolutely need to be considering, need to be thinking about, because these are what the top guys are doing?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. But one of the things that we found in our research, which is they followed the framework, but there was so much innovation and I would say also creativity in terms of how they implemented different tactics within the organization that aligned to the framework. And I'll give you one simple example around the CEO, and any CEO who's listening to this. This is something I would do in the next month or next couple of weeks, and it came from one of the CEOs in our research. And I'll tell the story, and then it connects to the actual exercise. So a first time, one of the questions that we ask CEOs, which is, if you could go back in time, what's the most important advice that you'd give to kind of new CEOs? And one of the CEOs talked about his very first board meeting, and he's sitting in the board meeting, and the chairman of the board says, okay, we're going to go into executive session now. And the CEO did not understand what that meant. So he just sat there. And the chairman looked at him again and said, excuse me, but we're going to executive session now. So what that really means is we're kicking you out of the room so we could talk about you. So he sheepishly got up, left the room. And as he closed the door behind him, he thought, that this is actually a great idea. Why wouldn't I do this within my own company? I'll just call it the reverse executive session. And so what he did is in his next leadership meeting, he kicked himself out of the room, instructed his HR leader to talk to the executive team to collect feedback around what he's doing well, what he could be doing differently, how to improve the leadership meeting. So it's a mechanism that he uses twice a year. It's a real, think of it like as a simple 360. But he calls it the reverse executive session. If you think about why that's so powerful, right? Which is, one is for the CEO, they're the ultimate standard setter in the organization. So what are you role modeling as the CEO? So when you take an action like that, what are you role modeling? You're role modeling transparency, your continuous improvement, openness. So those are all, and you can think about that practice. That practice can cascade to the executives doing it with their teams. And so getting that insight or that feedback so you're able to adapt the organization is so important. So that's just one example. And I was saying that, I don't know if you'd add anything to that.
I'll share another example that I love from one of the CEOs in our research. She talked about a blank sheet exercise. And so as part of their annual strategy refresh, she would take a half a day or a day with the leadership team and ask the team, if we were to start a business today to compete with us, what would it look like? What would we do? How would we approach it? What would our value proposition be? And they would really build out this business plan around a competitor. And then as they went through that exercise, they would then take some of those ideas and incorporate them into their own business strategy to say, how do we stay fresh and stay ahead of the competition before somebody comes and disrupts us? So something that Taavo and I ask clients that we work with a lot is, what does disruption look like for your business? If you look at what Uber did to the taxi industry, right? Complete change in how people approach transportation. And obviously now the taxi industry is playing catch up, right? Where you can book online and pay and do those kinds of things. But it was so far behind and took so long for them to catch up. And so what can CEOs do with their teams to try to think ahead of what could disruption look like? And, and AI is a great example, right? Where things are changing and moving so quickly. So what could disruption look like? And how do we try to disrupt ourselves instead of waiting for a competitor to disrupt us and cause damage as a result?
And I would build on that. Just my last point that I make around this, which is when you think about our book, The 5X CEO, I think it's not explicit, but it's implicit in the book, which is what these CEOs represented. They weren't chief problem solvers. They were more like chief system designers. And so they spent their time being like the architects of their organization to drive the scale and impact that they needed to. And so let me give you just like a simple example around what that looks like. And Sam mentioned AI. So I have a client currently who owns 40 different businesses. And each one of those businesses has a GM. And so when you think about the operating review process, the monthly operating review process, it can be quite burdensome. What he's done, and this speaks to kind of the innovation as well around, architecting systems to shape the future. What he's done is he has each GM record a 20-minute video, and he first goes through, have them go through the P&L, the balance sheet, and then he has them talk about what they're doing around price, cost, growth, and then the critical enablers as well around culture and talent in terms of what they're doing. And so he has transcripts of all these, of these 40 videos, and he feeds it actually into AI. And so he's trained the AI agent to be able to understand, like, how well are they following our playbook? What are the key issues I need to be focused on? And as an example, he discovered that one of the businesses is about $500,000 short on revenue that month. And the primary reason why was around plant capacity. So what he's doing is he's reducing the amount of time to identify problems to expand the time to fix the problems. And that's the value of being a system builder, and also around being able to leverage AI. So any CEO out there, and also private equity firm, like, there is so much opportunity around AI. It's almost like you can skip to work every day to be thinking about how to further leverage it.
Absolutely. So what do you guys watch, read, listen to that you recommend that others should check out? Obviously, including your own book that you've released.
We're completely biased to the 5X CEO. So we'll start with that. We are also huge Patrick Lencioni fans, which we had talked about earlier. So 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, The Advantage, so many amazing tools. We frequently recommend Sandy Ogg's book, Move, which is another great book for CEOs about how to lead. So I'll pass to Taavo. What else would you like to recommend?
Yeah, I think a classic I'd also recommend, and Alex, I think he's on your podcast as well, Adam Coffey, the Private Equity Playbook. That's also a must read.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Patrick Lencioni is my favorite author for management leadership, and I've read a lot of books. And his book, The Motive, for me is exceptional. With regards to that fable, it just so helps that he also writes everything in a private equity lens as well. So that was a Brucey bonus, but certainly a very good book to give actions to and give some reflection. If somebody wants to reach out to you guys post this podcast, how best to do so, please?
Our website is advantageceo.com, and you can catch Taavo and I. I'm Sam at advantageceo.com. Taavo is Taavo, Taavo, at advantageceo.com. So feel free to reach out.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for sharing your time and all the insights that you have on the best possible chief executive, something every private equity firm can learn from. The averages we see is around most private equity firms, of course, unless you work with Raw Selection on executive search, but most private equity firms are below 25% on success rate with their CXO hires. So certainly an area that every private equity firm, from big and small, can work on. But thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, Alex.
And thank you very much for everybody yet again tuning in and listening to the Private Equity Podcast. Till the next time, keep smashing it, and thank you very much for listening.